This talk will give you principles on how to communicate effectively with limited resources to different audiences. My name is Maarit Eronen, and I'm an author and filmmaker, and currently in my home country, Finland. Years ago, I was working with the homeless ministry as a director of communications in New York City. And then I was in Finland for the summer, and I was invited to share my testimony at the church. I had prepared a 5-7-minute talk. And once I got there, I found out that I was on for the sermon. And then on top of that, I found out that the Sunday service was the celebration for the confirmation camp and attendance. So my audience went from middle-aged elderly people to teenagers, and I panicked. How can I be relevant to these young people? I rushed to the bathroom and I was praying fervorously that God will help me to tweak my 5-minute, 10-minute message into a sermon and not be boring, so that these young people will, some of them had just decided to follow Jesus, that they would not stop after this celebration. The challenge is, how are we relevant and how are we effective in our communication? That's the challenge. Why is it important to be effective? Well, there is ever increasing competition of attention. And often we work with limited resources. We have limited people, we have time, limited time, equipment, skills, money. We are limited in our resources. But if we know a few principles, then our limited resources don't have to be a hindrance. And that requires some thought. Effective communication requires some thought. Communication is serving. Consider Jesus. He lived as a man. Now I guess he would be considered a young adult, in one country and in one season, one time in history. Yet he is able to identify with anyone throughout history. And he can get his message to the people, whoever wants to listen. He was a carpenter, but he had to learn to speak fisherman language because his disciples were fishermen. And he also learned to take the available technology into consideration to serve him by often speaking, or sometimes at least speaking from the boat, so that he knew that the voice carries over the water, and he used that as an amplification. So he also said to his disciples in Matthew chapter 10, verse 40, anyone who receives you receives me, and anyone who receives me receives the Father who sent me. So how do we make ourselves and our message receivable so that the viewer or the reader can receive Jesus and God's will for their lives through our message? This applies to any kind of communication. The layout of your magazine or flyer, how user-friendly is your website? Do you have spelling mistakes? How have you filmed and edited your video? Are these communication pieces receivable so that the content can be heard? Communication is serving. Primarily, it's not about you and what you need, but it's about what your audience, who your audience is, and what they need. How do you know if you are serving? Paul had one message of salvation. Yet he shared his message differently depending on who he was talking to. If it was the Jews or the Greeks or the Romans, it's like he had a candy and then he wrapped it differently. In marketing terms, this is called targeting. First of all, whatever you communicate, it is important to define your target audience. Take, for example, the Gospels. They were written differently because their target audience differed. For example, Matthew used a lot of references to the Old Testament. And so who was his audience? The Jews. Luke, however, wrote to a Roman, Theophilus, and so he used words and content that was relevant to him. So when you communicate, you need to take your target audience into consideration, and this is very important because that will determine your visuals, your colors, the speed of the video, the music, the words, the typefaces that you use, and then the medium that you choose to use to get your message through. In order to serve your audience well, you need to know who your target audience is and what they like and what they need. So this is more than knowing, which also you have to know the age and the language they speak and, maybe their socioeconomic background and education. But more than that, you need to know their need. How can you know what your audience needs? I have found that the most important way for me to be effective in my communication is to answer 4 questions. 1, what do they need? 2, what are their pain points? 3, what are they afraid of? And 4, what are they proud of? These questions help me kind of get into the head or the heart of the person or the group that I'm communicating to. And this will determine the content and the way I present it. How can you find answers to these questions? Of course, you can ask someone who represents your target audience, or you can do a study or conduct a research, or you can use your imagination and your past, your own experiences to determine and try to identify, put yourself in the shoes of your target audience. So that's what I did. In preparation for this talk, I tried to answer these questions. I defined as your need to communicate effectively with limited resources. And what are your pain points? Maybe disappointment and frustration on how your communication efforts are not bringing the desired results, maybe. And I defined your fear as not being able to make a difference in God's kingdom. And what I thought you would be proud of is that you are willing, you know Jesus, you are willing to follow him, and you want to serve him and make a difference for him. And now you have to judge how off I was with my answers. But anyways, these determined the content of this talk. After you have identified your audience, it is vital that you clarify your message. You have something you want to communicate. You have a message. And this is the key now. Listen, this is the key. How does your message answer the needs and the pain points and the fears of your audience? It's not about what you think they need and how you think you can answer their needs, but you have to wrap your message in a way that it actually answers their needs and pain points and fears somehow. For example, recently I was asked to speak at a women's retreat, and they asked me to write a press release to advertise the event. My topic was guidance, so hearing God and obeying Him, and obeying God. And the organizers thought that this was a relevant message for their women, and then their need was to get the people there. But how to persuade the people to come? Because if we said you need to come so that you can hear and learn that you need to obey God, and if we did that, people would not have come. Not many would have come anyway. We chose to tap into the uncertainty the war in Ukraine was creating in people's lives for future, and also for their need to feel that their lives had purpose, and that in the end of their lives they would think that no, it wasn't wasted, but it had meaning and purpose. So hearing and obeying God from our perspective would take them to leading a meaningful life. So we chose to communicate the theme for the event as finding steps to meaningful life. And that created curiosity, and people came. So I don't know, does this make sense? So in conclusion, you communicate effectively with limited resources if you define and consider your target audience. What are their needs, their fears, their pain points? And then you clarify your message to yourself first. What is it that you want to communicate? And then you revamp it to answer the needs and the fears and the pain points of the audience. And this way, hopefully, you will be more effective in your communication with limited resources.